All right, there are notes. I made about half of what would be needed for today, assuming that many of you would hold on to your notes from last week because we only got halfway through. So if you need notes, Todd Nichols back there has some copies. So raise your hand. We also could photocopy if we needed to make more. What's that? That's a spare. Okay, well, we're going to get started. And so we're on lesson 4, which is entitled Objective Truth. And last Sunday, we made it through the section on defining tolerance. And then we had a lengthy conversation on the section entitled Dignitary Harm. And so we're picking up today with the third of these categories entitled What is Wrong with the World? But before we go to that, I want to just tell you about something that happened last week. And I'll do this from time to time when there's something that appears in the news that I think is significant enough to merit some conversation concerning it. So this is not in your notes, and I'm going to turn back to an article that I printed out related to this issue. Some of you might have heard this if you listen to podcasts. That's where I heard this initially. But Bethany Christian Services, have you ever heard of Bethany Christian Services? It's an adoption and foster care agency that is from an evangelical perspective. It is interesting if you think about it. If you go back in our nation's history, you realize that a lot of these kinds of organizations have deep Christian roots, and many of them still do. But also you think of hospitals in our nation's history. You know, if you think about names of hospitals, in Portland, there's Providence, and of course that's a Christian doctrinal title. Sacred Heart in Spokane, St. Anthony's in Pendleton, well, even Good Shepherd in Hermiston, and you know, on and on it goes. So many hospitals do have Christian names associated to them, and that's a reminder to us that most of those organizations were started by Christians with Christian convictions. And they started them, well, why did they start? Why did Christians start hospitals? Yeah, and because they operated out of a Christian worldview, right? I mean, they understood the Imago Dei, that men and women are made in the image of God. That's what Imago Dei means. It's a Latin phrase meaning image of God. And so there was this understanding that we have a responsibility and an obligation to minister to people because of our Christian convictions. And so you have something similar with many adoption and foster care agencies, and many of those still retain either their Catholic or their evangelical background. Whereas I think most hospitals that you would mention today, like Providence in Portland or Emmanuel in Portland, I don't think there's probably any strong Christian connection today, necessarily. But so anyway, that's a long introduction. Bethany Christian Services is a evangelical-based organization that does adoptions and foster care work. And so I'm just going to read some of my underlines from a lengthy article. Yesterday, it was announced that Bethany Christian Services is going to now begin providing services to LGBTQ parents nationwide. And of course, I just stop and ask, what would be your concern with that? If you're a Christian adoption agency functioning out of a Christian worldview with a Christian doctrinal position, why would you have some hesitation, or would you have a hesitation about facilitating foster care or adoption to LGBTQ couples? What would be your concern? Yes, I would think that if you're running a Christian adoption agency, that you would preference putting children into homes where they are going to be taught a Christian worldview, and you're going to put children into homes that really do express your own convictions and beliefs. And so this gets into a much bigger discussion that we don't really have time for, but really the idea that children flourish best in a home where there is a mother and there is a father. And we realize that many homes today don't have that, and there are folks in here who don't have that benefit as well. And that's part of living in a broken world, and we recognize that. And we recognize that many single parents labor under a burden and do the best they can given the set of circumstances that they're dealing with. But the ideal, of course, would be a mother and a father, and if you're a Christian organization, it would be to place your children into a Christian home. And so anyway, this major organization is now going to facilitate adoptions to LGBTQ parents nationwide. I'm skipping down now. The world is now demanding, the moral revolutionaries are now demanding that every single individual in every society, every single institution, every single school, every single religious denomination, every single adoption and foster care agency must pivot. And the pivot in this case means capitulation. And so again, we're not talking about the church. We're talking about parachurch organizations. Christian colleges, in this instance, a Christian adoption agency. Again, skipping down, we saw the same thing writ large across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts acted when it legalized same-sex marriage to say that it would not do business with any organization that did not accept its definition of marriage now, including same-sex marriage. And that meant that even then, the largest adoption and foster care agency in the state of Massachusetts that had been doing noble work for a matter of many decades, Catholic Charities, had to cease its operations because it had a choice. It was forced into a choice. It could either stand for Catholic doctrine and theology, or it could continue its ministry. And it decided to keep Catholic as a part of Catholic Charities. So they stopped doing work in the state of Massachusetts. This is a number of years ago now. I don't know if any of you remember this. The author is going back probably 7-8 years ago when that was current. What we see here in the case of Bethany Christian Services is that the part they are giving up is actually the Christian convictional part. The part they've decided to retain is with the government at the state and local, and for that matter, conceivably at the national level, that are now meeting the demands of the moral revolutionaries. So it's a historic moment. In the year 2007, Bethany Christian Services had adopted a statement, and that statement read, God's design for the family is a covenant and a lifelong marriage of one man and one woman. That has now disappeared from their statement. If you go to their statement, that's now gone. So I'm just sharing that with you. There's more I could read to you, but it's a sad thing, I think. And it's a troubling thing when you have Christian organizations who are just sort of throwing in the towel and saying, we're going to just continue to do business and we're going to change our doctrinal position in order to just meet the demands of the moment. And so you've got the point being that every organization, every person really is going to have to ultimately decide on this. You can't hide from this. And so here you have, I've given two examples. One was Catholic Charities who said, we're going to retain the word Catholic, and that means we're going to give up working in certain locations. And here you have Bethany who's taken the exact opposite position, and it seems to me they're giving up their Christian convictions in order to continue to work in the foster care and adoption or community. So that was in the news last week, and I just wanted to take a moment to share that with you. All right, so now the notes. Yes?
Haven't we ever heard about Islamic institutions in America getting the same treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have an absolute answer for that. Do you have some thoughts? I mean, there's not a lot of such organizations, I suppose, you know, compared to Catholic or evangelical organizations. I mean, you could make the comment that, you know, Islam, unlike Christianity, is an honor religion. There is a real difference there, and we can say something about that. Islam is an honor religion in a way Christianity is not. And what I mean by that is that if you insult the Prophet Muhammad, as has happened from time to time over the years, you remember the magazine in Europe that they wrote, there was a cartoonist who put in some cartoons that was offensive, and they targeted that business, and they killed people who work for that business. And that's an honor-shame culture where, you know, if your prophet or your God is insulted, you have the responsibility to seek revenge and to retain the honor of the person who's been offended. Christianity's not that way, is it? I mean, we say turn the other cheek. Jesus said, pray for those who persecute you. And so it could be at some level, I might be overstating this, I probably am, but there is more risk to go after some versions of Islam, because the response could actually be violent. So that might be part of an answer, but I don't know. I don't have anything else to say on that. You're simply pointing out a sort of a double standard.
I am pointing out a double standard. I also think that politics play into it, and politics that elected the current president are also politics that do not point out the double standards and that promote Islam in the schools and all of those cases.
Yeah, and I would simply point out again, I think it's worth stating this. I mean, there probably are some people in this room, I assume there are, who don't agree with some of what I'm saying, maybe quite a bit of what I'm saying. And there might be someone sitting here today who thinks, well, LGBTQ people, they need the right to adopt as well, and it seems discriminatory to not give them that right. And at some level, I can meet you and say, I understand that argument. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that people with deep core religious convictions should not have to sacrifice those convictions to live in this culture. I feel that strongly, and the First Amendment of the Constitution, I think, would support that. We have an amendment, the Bill of Rights, the first Bill of Rights. Our first freedom is the freedom of religious liberty. And so when you're telling people that they can't live out of their deeply held religious beliefs, or they can't run a Christian organization based on their deep religious beliefs, I think that's fundamentally un-American. And I'll fight that one to the end. And it goes to the issue of last week of dignitary harm. People who say, well, you're doing harm to these other folks because you're saying they can't, your organization will not support them. That argument is reciprocal. It goes both ways. And when you tell someone they've got to violate their conscience in a way that will create shame in their mind before God Almighty, that is a terrible thing to do. And I think that people of goodwill, whether you're on the right or the left, I think the liberals from the 1960s who were all about free speech, some of them do agree with me on this, that you should not be forced to violate your conscience in the way that increasingly we are being forced to make those kinds of choices. All right, we got to move forward because we're not going to get very far today. I want to ask this question: what is wrong with the world? And I want to quote C.K. Chesterton, who was a Roman Catholic. He was a journalist, author, philosopher, deep thinker. And the story, of course, you've heard this before, I think. He read this question in a newspaper. And so the newspapers was just soliciting answers. You know, someone wrote an article, what's wrong with the world? And Chesterton wrote back, and of course his famous response was, what's wrong with the world? He gave a two-word answer, I am. That's what's wrong with the world. I am wrong. I am wrong. We are all wrong, was the point that he was making. But what I want to do with this is just ask the second question. Do you agree that something is wrong with the world? Does everybody agree with that? Is there anybody who doesn't agree with that? Okay. I think that question is surprisingly unifying. Because I don't care if you're on the right politically or on the left politically. Virtually everyone agrees that something is wrong with the world. And so people who don't agree on virtually anything, on a lot of the issues we're talking about in this Sunday school class, they would not agree on these issues. And yet to that question, there is a almost universal agreement. Something is wrong with the world. Now, so if you're a progressive, if you're a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, you're a progressive, that label comes from originally the 1870s, and then Woodrow Wilson and FDR in the first half of the 20th century. What's the idea there? Well, the idea is that something's wrong with the world and we're progressing to get things fixed, right? And so there's a worldview in that. And the worldview is that we're moving in the right direction and we're correcting the ills and the wrongs of this world. And maybe someday, we'll fully arrive. If you're a conservative, well, the word conservative is more about conserving. And so conservatives tend to be more traditionalists, and their tendency is so the progressive looks forward and says, we're going to create, almost at times, we're going to create the kingdom of God without God. But we're going to do this as we progress along and as we improve culture and society. The conservative does the opposite. He's looking, or she's looking more backwards and saying if we could just get back to the good old days when people knew God and feared God, then we'd have it figured out, and that would be better. And I love Vodi Bakum, who comments on that mentality. And Vodi Bakum is a preacher. He's a black man. He's probably about 250, maybe more than that, real big guy. And he simply points out to crowds like our crowd, he says, I lived in the 1950s and it wasn't that good. Okay? Now, if you lived in the South in the 1950s and you're a black man, it wasn't that good. The good old days weren't that good. But what both these perspectives do have in common, one is looking forward for salvation. The other tends to look backwards for salvation. Both have a worldview and even an understanding of history and where history is going. But both of them agree at the point in time in which we're living, something is wrong with the world. Okay? And I think that's unifying. We can come together on that one point. Now, I read years ago now, I don't remember where I read it. I've tried to find the article, but it made an impression upon me. And the article was dealing with, the thesis was the need of every young man in our culture to have at least one person, one male in his life. And the article described this male as a straight arrow. And that, you understand what I mean by that, don't you? I assume you do. That every young man needs one older male in his life who can be described as a straight arrow. And that could be a father. That would be the most natural person. But it could be an uncle. It could be a stepfather. It could be a coach. It could be a mentor. It could be a pastor. It could be a Sunday school teacher. But one person who has that young man's ear and is speaking into his life and is saying to him, this is the road to walk. Walk with me in it. And don't walk this other road. That's the broad road that leads to destruction. And this article was written to men and to young boys and like junior high school boys who are on the verge of being men. But I'm sure that something similar would be true of women. and the role of an older woman in a younger woman's life. But the point being, of course, that if you have a category called straight arrow, doesn't that suggest that we all understand that there's something called a broken arrow, right? And so the category of straight arrow doesn't really make any sense unless there's another category called broken arrow. Or the category there's something wrong with the world, which we've all agreed is true. And I'm suggesting to you that if we went door to door in Stanfield today and just started to ask that one question, is there something wrong with the world? I don't know that we'd find a single person in this whole town who would say, no, nothing's wrong with the world. The world's perfect. So everybody agrees that something's wrong with the world. What does that tell you? That doesn't make any sense unless there's a standard of rightness by which that assessment is being made. You see what I'm getting at here? And so there's a fill-in. The universal acknowledgement that there's something wrong with the world and the pressing need for men in our culture to be rightly described as straight arrows betrayed the fact that we live in a moral universe. The statement that there's something wrong with the world only makes sense in the context of a standard of rightness. And so that's the fill-in. And so this really does get us very close to the phrase that I come back to on a regular basis from Francis Schaeffer, who, you perhaps read some Schaeffer books over the years, and he was a very influential individual. Schaeffer was the person who said there is something called true truth in this world. And true truth, we live in a world where people tend to fudge on this, and we live in a pluralistic world, and we live in a world where everything is sort of relative. And Francis Schaeffer was saying, no, there is something called true truth. There is truth in this world. And by the way, I've presented this to you by asking the question, is there something wrong with the world? If you said, yes, there's something wrong with the world, then you cannot be a relativist. You've condemned yourself. And I think you could go to a lot of folks in our culture who live, they function as if there really isn't any truth, and they function as if they can make up their own rules, because one of the major values in our culture is what's called the autonomous self. I'm a law unto myself. But once they say to me, there's something wrong with the world, they, in a sense, have put their own neck in the noose. Because if they then deny that there's, if you start to talk about God, and there's the only way that this makes sense is if there's something outside of the system, namely God, who's above and beyond, who's defining right and wrong for us. You see, they've betrayed what they actually know to be true, even if they won't function that way in terms of how they live their lives. Does that make sense? So I think this question, what is wrong with the world, is a really important question. You might use it on your kids even, or your relatives who fight with you over politics. And just ask them the question, do you think there's something wrong with the world? If they say yes, well, you do have a standard of right and wrong, though, and where does that come from? If it doesn't come from God, where does that come from? All right? So we want to talk a little bit about determining truth without God. And just by way of getting at this, consider doing ethics in the box. That's the fill in there. Trying to do ethics in the box. Now, if I had had more time, I would have brought a box with me, a large box. I would have wanted to wrap this box probably in black paper, and I'd have it maybe sitting on that table. And I would suggest to you by way of illustration that I want you to think of everything inside that box. So what is everything? I mean, everything in this world. Every material thing. This world without reference to God is what I'm thinking of. And so all people are in that box. I guess all matter is in that box. the universe, so to speak, is in that box. So if that's all we have, how do you do ethics inside the box without God? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
You can't. Anything goes.
Yeah, Sue said you can't. Yes. You want to elaborate on that?
Because it's just whoever's going to be the strongest voice in that box that determines morality.
Yeah, so then might makes right, is what you're saying. That's one possibility. So think about dignity. We've been talking about dignitary harm the last couple of weeks, and dignity is a big value in our culture, isn't it? I mean, that's driving a lot of folks, and that's not wrong necessarily, right? I mean, are we concerned about dignity? Do we believe that people have value? Why do we believe that from a Christian worldview? What's our primary response? The Imago Dei. Every single person is created in the image of God. It doesn't matter whether you're 6'9" or 5'9" or under 5 feet. It doesn't matter whether you weigh 300 pounds or you weigh 76 pounds. It doesn't matter whether you're white, black, or some other color. It doesn't matter what even you believe, whether you're the most liberal, progressive. Nancy Pelosi. You know, Nancy Pelosi has worth and dignity because she is made in the image of God. It doesn't matter whether you're Donald Trump. You know, from the other side, I mean, man, you can imagine sticking Nancy and Donald on a desert island by themselves. How terrible that would be. Because, I mean, I think it's true that there is a mutual hatred there among those two individuals. And yet, from a Christian worldview, we would say that both of those individuals have worth and dignity because they are made in the image of God. And so their worth and dignity is directly connected to the idea that God is God and that God created them in his image. Okay? So let me just read a paragraph to you and see how you respond to this in terms of, again, trying to do ethics in the box without God. Nothing inside the box grounds equality or dignity or value. If we're all just bodies in a box, then mine is not equal with Usain Bolt's. You know who Usain Bolt is? You guys know, right? Who's Usain Bolt? What's that? No, this is the way we describe it. He is a freak of nature. What, is he from Jamaica? And I don't know how tall he is, but he looks really tall for a sprinter. 6'6", and of course I was going to say he's an African American, but he's a black man. He's not an American, so he's not an African American as we think of it. He's the fastest man in the world. Now, I don't know if he still is. He's aged a bit now. He's not at the top of his game, and this book was written just a couple of years ago. But the point being, let me read that again. Nothing inside the box grounds equality or dignity or value. If we're all just bodies in a box, then mine is not equal to Usain Bolt's. I mean, as handsome as I am. I mean, when I call my wife messed with my phone. And so it's also in my truck. You know, I've got one of those screens, you just push a button, it calls her. And it's the most wonderful woman in the world. That's what she's put in my phone. Amen. And in her phone, for me, it's something like handsome one or fine and handsome one. Okay. Yeah, I mean, these things are in the eye of the beholder, right? But if we get outside of the twisted, bias of a husband and wife, Usain Bolt is far superior to me physically, certainly in a running event, okay? He can run a 40-yard dash in about 4 seconds. Or, to continue, Brad Pitt, who can pull off skinny jeans without looking ridiculous. Okay, let me keep reading. Only if there is someone good, someone beyond the box who made the box, someone whose image all of us bear, regardless of our physical, economic, sexual, or political status, that things like equality, dignity, and value become more than bumper sticker slogans. I like the way he puts that. That's Thaddeus Williams in a book entitled Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. And so what he's getting at in part is that a lot of these conversations about dignity and worth, if you're from a secular worldview, you're really borrowing capital from Christianity. And you're living on that borrowed capital. Because there's actually little in your own worldview that anchors worth and dignity to anything that can bear that up. And so just to point out to us, if we're trying to do ethics just simply inside the box, we really can't make that work well. And people, of course, do have inconsistencies, and we all do at some level. But the Christian worldview makes sense of something like worth and value and dignity because the Christian worldview is rooted in objective truth. The objective truth of who God is and who God declares us to be because we are made in His very image. And so I'm suggesting to you that so much in our culture, which turns into really angry rants about this perceived slight or this individual or this group who is so clearly morally wrong or deficient, and yet their righteous indignation isn't rooted in anything that can really bear it up. They're almost like a person, if you can imagine a person standing on a ladder and the ladder is just pulled out from underneath them and they're just sort of hanging there in air, making these statements that have all sorts of right and wrong associated with those statements, and yet they're not grounded in anything that allow them to consistently make those statements. And I'll just stop there and ask if there's any observations or questions about what I'm trying to convey here.
It seems like throughout history, every time people have gotten away from God's creation of human beings as having worth and dignity, evil steps in. Because you can think of the Holocaust, you can think of slavery, ancient slavery in the 1800s. And even now, people are starting to see their opponents as being not worth it. And we as Christians have to, it's very important that we don't step into that. The minute we start thinking of people we don't like them the other, we're getting away from God's creation.
Yeah, we're not living out a Christian worldview. And that's why Christians, and you know, I mean, this rebukes a lot of us. I mean, how many times have you heard or have you yourself been guilty of talking about a politician who you don't agree with in really unflattering ways? Okay? And you know, when you do that, you do need to understand that that is a fundamentally un-Christian response. Now, I'm not saying don't speak the truth. If you disagree with a politician on policy, by all means say that. Or if you disagree with a politician because the politician has moral defects of character, I see nothing wrong with saying that. But I think you understand the difference, right? When you're criticizing and you're just trashing. And we should never trash other people, because when you do that, the message that's being sent is that they're trash. And if you believe a Christian worldview, you cannot say that any person is trash. You know, and you think about, I've been reading a book this week on the transgender movement, and it's been very helpful for me to just be reminded that these are folks who have tremendous struggles in life.
Amen.
And we'll talk more about that in weeks to come. But to see their dignity and their worth, even as you say what they believe is incredibly dangerous, and it's incredibly dangerous to my Christian worldview and to my freedoms. But to be able to find that speaking truth, but always doing so from a heart of love rather than a heart of hate. And of course, some of that, you don't. I think I have to work at this because I have a tendency at times to say things in a passionate spirit and to say things with conviction. But I got to tell you, when I'm talking about these issues, I do not have hate in my heart. And we can't have hate in our hearts. Someone's hand went up, and Lloyd.
The way I see things is, it's kind of occurred to me that a lot of these issues that are sort of, in a sense, black and white, nobody can find a middle on it. I would suggest that one side is arguing out of reason, and the other side is arguing out of emotion. And I don't know how you can have that argument be productive in any way.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to what you're saying, Lloyd, and I don't have the answer, so I'll ask Dan, do you want to comment on that, or do you have a different comment?
This is not direct. I was going to say, we had a veterinary student one time ride with us, and she was really smart and very articulate. And somehow we got into deeper things. I don't remember how, but she said, "I'm an atheist, but I believe in right and wrong." That was, whoa, wait a minute. And it was a couple days she was with us, and we had various times to revisit that. And ultimately, she told me to quit talking to her about some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But the point, I guess, being is that I think a lot of people are kind of will submit to that sentence right there. I'm an atheist, but I believe in right and wrong. And that's a completely irrational position, and we understand that. But I think the acknowledgement has to be that that's where we would all be, except for the power of the gospel. They're blind.
Yeah, except for the grace of God.
Except for the grace of God.
So I think it's...
I don't understand. There's really no other way of making sense of it than that. I think it speaks a little bit to this idea of reason versus emotion also.
I think it's been very helpful for me, and maybe this is helpful for you too, particularly if you're a young person here today, and you're, if you're going to be honest with us, you're saying, I don't know what I think about church, I don't know what I think about any of this stuff, I don't know what I think about God, or there might be a God, but beyond that, I don't really know what to think, and I'm really, there's a lot of folks out there in that category. Years and years ago, someone said to me, when it comes to worldviews, like a Christian worldview versus a secular worldview, those are the two flavors that we're really focusing on this morning, and this whole issue of objective truth and which one of those worldviews can deal adequately with this reality of objective truth that we've all acknowledged there's a reality to that. And the man said, accept the worldview that answers the most questions with the fewest difficulties. And I've always remembered that. He was acknowledging that every worldview has problems. The Christian worldview has problems. But which worldview answers the most questions with the fewest problems? And now we're off the notes again for just a moment, but think about suffering. People will say, I can't be a Christian because there's so much suffering in the world. And that is a weighty objection. But there's another sense in which the Christian worldview makes sense of suffering in a way that other worldviews don't. So I'm back to Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, very liberal. And he was thinking about these things, and he was an atheist. He was thinking about dying. There's oftentimes suffering on the way to death. And his comment was, when I think about these things, I simply stop thinking, go downstairs, and play solitaire. So if your worldview causes you to think less than more, there might be a problem. And if you think about the Christian view of suffering, is that whatever you suffer, there's a purpose in it. Because God is wise and God is good. And whatever God brings into your life, even if you can't see it or understand it, there is a purpose in this. And God is using it ultimately for His good purpose. And if you're in Christ, for the good of you also. Cancer is equal opportunity. It doesn't care whether you're a believer or an atheist. So try to imagine facing a terminal illness as an atheist. If you face it as a Christian, guess what? There's hope. As an atheist, there is no hope. And so even on an issue like that one, I'll tell you, if I go to visit someone on their deathbed, I have a message of hope that I bring to them. If I were an atheist, I don't think I'd go to their deathbed, because I'd have nothing to say to them, because there is no hope. And so which worldview answers the most questions with the fewest difficulties? And I think the Christian worldview excels when we think of it in those terms. Okay, we've got to move on, though, as we're running out of time here. There's a second fill-in, and I'll give it to you, and then we'll just move forward. Acknowledging the God who is outside the box. Okay, and we've said enough, I think you understand what I'm saying. The only way that truth really makes any sense, that there is a true truth, is if there is a God who is outside the box, who is above and over us, and is a transcendent reality. And then I want to say something as we close here about the witness of natural law. That's the final section here. Natural law can be defined as follows. So here's a definition for you. A moral order divinely implanted in mankind and accessible to all persons through human reason. Now, by the way, that definition is coming from the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology with a publication date of 1984. And I didn't notice it until just now that definition is dated. How is it dated? You wouldn't write it that way. There's one word that I don't think you'd use, you'd change it. Mankind. Yeah, I don't think you'd say it that way now. A moral order divinely implanted in mankind and accessible to all persons through human reason. What would you do today? Humankind or all people? You know, because that's more patriarchal type language, and that's really objectionable to a lot of people today. So if it's objectionable to you, I apologize. Just pass over that. A moral order that's divinely implanted and accessible to all persons through human reason. And reason here becomes important. Our minds are tainted by sin. We do not think the way we should. We do not think with the clarity that we should. But nevertheless, the argument of natural law is that there is something called creational intent. And we can understand this. Okay? So natural law affirms that the world was created with intentionality, and that though our minds are impacted by sin, we can still understand God's creational intent. Now this is an argument. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, how does that line up with Reformed theology and Calvinism?
Do you mean because of Calvinism's teaching on depravity?
Yeah.
I'm a Reformed person, so I'm speaking for the movement because that's me, right? I would say that what I just said a moment ago, we are depraved and fallen people, and the fall impacts every part of our person, including our minds. Our minds do not think the way they should think because sin is like a disease that impacts our thinking. So while acknowledging that, I would also say there is value in this something called natural law because our minds are tainted by sin, but we still do think. And we can still think rightly. at points. Okay, so there's some value to that. And I think there's value because Paul uses this basic argument in Romans 1. So if you have a Bible, you could turn there. I think this is an argument that we need to learn how to make well in the culture that we're living in. And again, the argument is that creation displays a creative intent. And if we believe in God, we believe in truth, then that created intent is coming from God. So Paul in Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, I mean, these are some of the harsher words found in the New Testament, but they are in the Bible. For this reason, and in the context is because people have rejected God. They have suppressed the knowledge of God. They have held that knowledge down. They know that He exists, but they won't acknowledge it. So their unbelief is moral, not intellectual, primarily. So, given that background, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. So that's God surrendering people to their sinful desires. I've illustrated that in the past this way. I used to have a little dog, a Boston Terrier, with a pug nose. I've had several of these dogs. I don't know if I recommend them as pets. They have virtues and vices. But this little dog was so misbehaved that we took her to obedience school. And so there we were at obedience school with the little dog Charlotte, and we were with all the German Shepherds and Rottweilers. And I still remember this. The instructor, it was a woman, and I remember the lilt in her voice, sort of the condescension, when she looked us over, and she saw this little dog, and we had the kind of leash that had a trigger on it. You know, you could give the dog 5 feet or 10 feet. And she said, first thing, get rid of that leash. You're just allowing the dog to rule. You know, because the dog pulls and you give the dog more leash. You get a short leash, you make the dog walk right next to you. And I only went one time. I dropped out. I thought, this is too embarrassing, you know, to show up with this little dinky dog who will not obey me. But I think that's a helpful way of thinking. God gave them over. I mean, think of that leash that God does in what's called common grace, that He restrains our sinful tendencies. He holds us back. But when a person just stays in this unrepentant condition, God will at some point take His finger off the trigger, and He'll just give them leash. And that's a frightening thing to think about. Okay? I think that's the best way to think about it. In other words, God is not creating unbelief in these people's hearts. The unbelief is there. God is just simply releasing them to themselves. And that, by the way, that's how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You know, in the Old Testament, Exodus, those unusual, difficult passages, you know, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. I think it's this kind of thing. He gave Pharaoh over to his heart. Okay, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged, notice the word here, natural relations, for those that are contrary to nature. The men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And so in this passage, one of the arguments that Paul uses as to why lesbian or homosexual behavior is outside of God's moral will and outside of what is right and wrong is an argument from nature. And that's the argument of natural law. Again, let me read the definition to you. A moral order divinely implanted in mankind and accessible to all persons through human reason. Now, let me give you a definition. This is interesting. And you can't talk about this stuff unless you're just able to talk, right? Because we're talking about stuff you don't talk about this stuff in polite company, right? Especially with young people in the room. The word genitals. Now, assume you know what that word means. If you don't, then that's your bliss, right? We'll just talk right over your head. But the word genitals, do you know where that word comes from? It comes from Latin, and we derive our word generations from that word. Why? What's being suggested by that? Yeah, procreation, right? In other words, the ancients who spoke Latin thousands of years ago, when they thought about those parts of a person and tried to understand what is the function, what is the purpose, what is the creational intent, and they chose the word genitals because they recognized that the intent is ultimately it's procreation. It's to create a new generation. It's to keep the human race going. Now, we'd be quick to add that that's not the only intent within God's purposes, right? I have a book that I give to young people when they go through marriage counseling, and it's written by Ed Wheat. It's kind of dated now. Maybe you've read it, maybe you haven't. It's entitled Created for Pleasure, right? So we recognize that. But the argument of natural law is very basic when it comes to the issues we're talking about. It's saying there is a God, and he has a creative intent. And we can understand this creative intent, and we really should submit ourselves to the wisdom of that created intent and to live out of it. And so, if you think about gay marriage, can you have procreation? Okay? Through adoption, but that's not procreation. You're creating a family, but it's not through through physical union of a man and a woman. So, the point I'm making is basic, isn't it? But we've lost this. I mean, if I were to be, I almost thought about doing this, and then I suggested, and someone said, no, you probably shouldn't do this. I thought about bringing, some illustrations here, because it would make the point. If I had two, what do you call these? If I had two, like bolts and screws, right? If I held up, the bolts are the long one, right? No, the bolts go on it, right? What are the long things called, Steve? Bolt and a nut. There you go, bolt and a nut. Yeah, forgive me. I'm not mechanical, obviously. A bolt and a nut. If I had two bolts and I held them up and I said, put these together, could you do it? If I had two nuts and I said, put these together, could you do it? But you can take the bolt and the nut and you can put them together, can't you? Now, I mean, someone said you probably shouldn't say that, but I don't know, it could be crude even. I don't know how you respond to that. But the point I'm making is very basic, isn't it? That within the human body, the male body and the female body are created for one another. There is a creative intention that is being expressed. And that results in procreation, which cannot happen between a woman and a woman and a man and a man. And so the argument of natural law is just simply saying that God has created the world in such a way that if we just use our minds, we can recognize that there is purpose and intention. And we should submit ourselves to that purpose and to that intention. So I'll stop there and just ask, any questions? We're out of time again, I see.
On that last point, in Psalm 119, it talks many times about the precepts, and in essence, that's a precept that we need to try to understand and fully understand that He laid out in His creation that was undeniable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's worth noting how many times the word natural is used in the
Yes.
the Federalist Papers and the Constitution and what they define as natural. But then
Yeah.
you get the look that was slavery natural, pointing back to the worldview.
But you're right. The language in the Declaration is coming out of this idea of natural law. So our forefathers, who many of them were not what I would consider evangelical Christians, but they did operate out of a basic Christian worldview, and it's expressed in how they wrote. Any other thoughts? All right, the discussion question. When Benjamin Franklin signed the Declaration of Independence, he supposedly stated, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we will hang separately." How does this statement help us to understand the importance of church community as we walk together into the gathering storm? So it's something to think about. We must all hang together, or we will most assuredly all hang separately. Of course, to understand the question, he's using the word hang in different senses, right? We either hang together like buddy up, stick together, be united, or we will hang separately because the British will put the noose around our necks one at a time. As he was saying to the colonists, the only way we can resist George III and the British Empire is if we hang together, and if we don't, we'll hang separately. And I just think about, as where we find ourselves as a culture, that one of the things that we really do need to rediscover, I think, is the importance of Christian community and the importance of brothers and sisters in Christ and really hanging together and sticking together, particularly because, we need allies and we need to be supported, we need to be encouraged, and where are we going to find that? So, okay, I'm going to ask one of you, and I'm going to rush out of here because we're